Hello, I'm Lex Parker and welcome to my Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. I've prepared the following series of videos to illustrate how I build wooden trestles. They're broken up into a series starting from building the deck, building the bents, and ultimately installing them in the layout. I hope this will be of some benefit to you. Not everybody wants to scratch build, but I think if you do want to scratch build, this can be very rewarding and the results very realistic. Thank you again. In this clinic I'm going to show you how I build trestles. This is what we're going to start off with, is building the deck. I'll show you how to do the stringers, how to lay the bridge ties, the guardrails, and a small deck for a fire barrel. We'll put some detail in there with some grain and some NBWs, and then the next stage we'll do is we'll start building some bents that will carry this deck across one of the gorges on my layout. There are two locations right now that will require some trestle bents to support the track. This is one here which is just a short span and not a very high trestle. Go across a rock cut across here, and will require some more bents to support the track going on to the beginning of the Howard Truss Bridge. And at the far end, it'll, as it leaves the bridge, it'll have some supports going into that rock cut. What you see here is an open span. This is the spline that I originally installed in the layout with the roadbed on top of it. We'll be cutting this section out here. I've marked out the locations for the bents and where they'll be located. When we cut this section out, we'll actually use this piece up here to lay the support for the bridge ties on that to get the right curve, and we'll really reinstall in this location. We'll cut out some of these areas back in here to put timber support to hold the rockwork back, making some adjustments in here, and then finish the scenery off around those bents. This is the second section where the spline goes across here and ties into the Howe through Truss Bridge. It's a little deeper here. I have again marked out the locations for the number of bents that will be required. We cut the scenery out here so we can put some cribbing retainment back in here, and then the bents in here, and they'll all be fitted into this scenery area that's just presently just roughed in. This is an example of two trestles completed earlier. Shows you what we're going to try and achieve on this next section with the new trestles and the scenery. The first thing I do is draw an elevation of a typical bent, and I did this to scale, in my case 1/4 inch to the foot or 1/48. I've identified all the different components with the size, so I know what size strip wood to use, and then I take and print that sheet and mount it onto a piece of stiff cardboard. Then after that's done, I take scraps of strip wood and I would lay a piece of timber in here and then glue the strip wood keepers on either side of it, so that as I assemble this, all these pieces will be kept in line and in place until the glue is set. One of the advantages of this is that when you're building multiples of anything, in this case the bents, you want them to be all exactly alike, so they all line up. And so every one of these patterns will be a duplicate of the first. They'll be exact and they'll all be in line. The first thing we'll be doing is building the support beams that carry the bridge ties. These are the ones here. There's 3 on each side, and they're closely positioned between each other because they normally have little spaces in here so the water can drain through them and not rot the timber out. They're actually 8 by 16 by 32 feet. 32 feet because that's the spacing between the bents. In that way, each of these timbers, the joint between them, all sit on one of these cords across the top of the trestle. I've selected the timbers now. They're ready for detailing. I'll first grain them and then stain them, and then I'll cut them to their 32-foot lengths. We only have to do a few of these because they'll be the ones on the outside, and they'll be the ones that's visible. So all the other ones don't really need to have any grain. But I typically use a file card like this, and this one I've had a number of years cleaning files so that all these little pins in here are quite sharp. And so what I do is I start off and just gouge it and do a little bit of a twist and a wiggle on it, because that's the way grain often is, and just sort of stripe it and keep striping it, and so on. So I do all of this on the wood before they're cut to length, because the grain then will not be continuous across the joints once we cut them in strips. It's also a lot easier to do long strips instead of all the little short ones. And just the next thing I do, and I do this on all the strip wood that I use. I use 4 or 6-0 steel wool. It's a real fine, and clean the wood. That deburrs all of the fine grain and little splinters that pop up. So I do that continuously on all the strip wood. Next I select the timber. In this case this is Mount Albert scale lumber, and these will be the beams that go across the tops of the bents. They're 8 inches by 16 inches, and typically I would cut them at 32 feet so that they go across 2 bents, but I would stagger them so that every other joint is on a bent top chord. Since the bents are at 16-inch centers, the beams between the going across the bents will be 16 feet. So what we'll do is we'll use the chopper and we'll cut several of these that will be on the outside at 16 feet centers. And so on. These are all the outside ones that have the grain on them already. Now that we've cut all the 16 footers, we sort out the ones that have the grain, because they'll be the ones that'll be on the outside edges, because that's what you'll see. And then there's 4, in this case there's going to be 4 32 footers that will bridge across 2 sets of bents. In other words, you're going to get 2 like this, 1 in the middle and 1 on each side. And what that does, that will stiffen the beam going across the bent. So that's the configuration approximately right there that will be assembled, and there'll be 2 of these on each chord straddling the bends. So you get a bent here and a bent there and a bent there and so on. What we now have to do is stain all this lumber, and typically this would have been probably creosoted, and I make my creosote stain using shoe dye, a combination of both black and a dark brown, mostly black, but I usually put a few drops of the dark brown into it just to warm it up, because this tends to be almost a little bit of a blue-black. Adding a little bit of brown adds a little bit of character to it. A little bit more brown warms up the black. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll let some of the pieces sit in the dye solution a little longer than others, so you get that variation between each of the timbers, and when you put them together you'll see the separations between the two with slightly differences in tone.